online at 560theanswer.com. Now, from the Signature Bank Studios. If you're looking for the latest news, insight into what it means, and the sharpest opinion, there's only one station in Chicago where you can turn, and it's this one. We're AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan Proft here, and Meet the Press host, Kristen Welker, who is just very limited. She teased an interview she did with French President Emmanuel Macron that we'll play, I guess, in its entirety this weekend. Yeah, something to look forward to. On GMA, or whatever the NBC version of that is. I don't know. Today Show, I guess. Who cares? Interchangeable. Here's what Macron had to say to Welker a couple of days removed from the big powwow at the White House on the prospects for peace in the Eastern European theater.
If he considers he can get a deal done, this is a great news. When I look at the situation and the facts, I don't see President Putin really willing to get peace now.
And President Macron had a stern warning. I'll read it to you. He said, quote, "The day we start accepting the recognition of territories being taken by force, this is just the end of international order."
Ooh, a stern warning from Macron. I know Welker was impressed by that. I could tell by the manner in which he relayed that important message from Macron. I guess it would be a little bit more compelling if we didn't know, and Putin didn't obviously know, that France imports about 400 million euros worth of liquefied natural gas from Russia and continues to do so. Then some of that is then repurposed to Germany, much more than they're providing in terms of aid to Ukraine. So, boy, he's skeptical of peace in Eastern Europe, and any sort of land swap, that's a dangerous precedent to set. Well, you pardon me, sir, but who let the situation get to this point? And who is still in bed with the enemy? At least we're to believe. So you can understand why Putin treats Western Europe with the respect it deserves. So where does that leave President Trump and the prospect for any sort of cessation of hostilities short of a Russian conquest of Ukraine, if you believe that is what's in Putin's interests, which is also a debatable statement? KT McFarland joins us to discuss. She's former First Deputy National Security Advisor to President Trump. Also author of the book Revolution, Trump, Washington, and We the People. KT, thanks so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. And I am so glad that you pointed out that the Europeans, who on one hand are outraged that Russia's doing everything that Russia's doing, and at the same time are making it possible for Russia to do what it's doing.
Nothing like financing both sides of the fight.
And
right.
the hypocrisy is just so overwhelming. How can they say this with a straight face? That, oh, well, we can't allow this, we can't allow that, when in fact they're the ones that are paying for it to happen.
Yeah, I mean, you listen to these guys and then you watch what they do, and you're almost like, why does Putin even care if Ukraine joins NATO? Because outside of America, what is NATO? These guys.
Yeah, and so just spare me their moral outrage and high principles. And I think that's one of the things President Trump has been talking to the Europeans about in private when they came to Washington. And I think it's part of the continuing conversation, which is, okay, guys, stop enabling Russia to fight this war. Stop buying Russian oil and gas. Frankly, we have a better alternative, buy American. And then secondly, if you're talking about security guarantees and we can't allow this, we can't allow that, what are you prepared to do? I mean, show me the money. Show me your ability to contribute to some kind of security guarantee to Ukraine, because you can't just expect the United States to do all the heavy lifting while, in fact, you're aiding and abetting the enemy.
Well, right, and it also undermines this idea that secondary sanctions will somehow uh, punish Putin severely enough that he comes to the negotiating table in good faith. Well, we can impose secondary sanctions to try to further cripple the Russian economy, but then we have our erstwhile NATO allies propping it up.
Well, secondary sanctions would affect them. That's the kind of what they're not talking about.
Yeah, right.
If we have secondary sanctions, means that we punish any country that's buying Russian oil, whether it's directly or indirectly. And as you point out, European countries are buying it in many cases indirectly. They're buying it. Say India buys the oil and gas, and then it kind of paints the side of the container and then sells it on to the European countries. And so the sanctions that they're talking about would affect the punishment that President Trump has talked about with India. Well, that would actually technically apply to the European countries as well.
Right. So then we have to play whack-a-mole with all our allies on top of everything else, on top of trying to deal with Putin. So, I mean, what is your perspective then on the chances for some sort of deal to come here, and what sort of timeline is realistic before Putin breaks the stalemate in Eastern Europe, if that is indeed his intention? In Eastern Ukraine, I should say.
Yeah. Look, there's just so many moving parts. I mean, Putin wants to delay any negotiations or any ceasefire because he thinks he's making progress, that he thinks that he is winning the war slowly, grindingly, a half a mile at a time. But he is winning the war, and he can keep fighting the war as long as our allies and other people are propping up his economy by buying his oil and gas. So for Putin, delay is what he wants. For China, delay is what they want, too. They want this war to go forever because then everybody's focused on Ukraine and Europe and Russia. Nobody's focused on what China's up to. As far as Ukraine, President Trump said it from the very beginning. You don't have the cards. I have all the cards. So I think that I am optimistic that President Trump will, in the end, find a deal. But there are going to be so many more, pivots and improvisation President Trump will have to do to sort of nudge both sides to an agreement. I keep thinking back to when I worked for Henry Kissinger in the early 1970s. There was something called shuttle diplomacy. So Henry went to the Middle East, and it was after the Arab-Israeli War of 1973. And Kissinger stayed in the Middle East for a month, and he had an airplane, and he would be in Israel in the morning to get their position, and then he would fly to Egypt to get their position, and then he would, come back to Israel, get their position, and then he would go to Jordan and then to Syria. At the end of a month, he was able to push them all towards an agreement. We're having shuttle diplomacy now, but the shuttling is the other countries are coming to see President Trump. But it's that sense of urgency and immediacy and momentum that don't underestimate how important that is. That kind of pushes everybody forward. You don't want to be the one who's sort of left out of the picture. So President Trump is right to keep pushing this at sort of warp speed. And when he finished at the White House 2 days ago, and I forget which leader said, well, great, let's reconvene in 2 months' time. And Trump said, 2 months' time? That's an awful lot more people that are getting killed. Let's reconvene right away. And so by pushing, I think that, in fact, is something that affects everybody, not just the Europeans, not just Ukraine, but Russia, too.
Well, and as part of that sense of urgency, because I've seen some estimates to this effect, that Ukraine may have a few more months only in terms of their ability to sustain the war effort and hold out.
Ukraine is running out of people, and Ukraine is not yet running out of weapons because President Trump has decided to continue to sell them weapons, but we're not paying for it anymore. I mean, we were on the hook for giving them the weapons, and we were paying for it, and it was to the disadvantage and taking away from our own military capabilities. At least the Europeans are paying for that. Mm-hmm. So that I see going forward. But, President Trump, the genius that he has of trying to thread the needle, it is such a tough lift because on one hand, he wants to have the war over with Ukraine having some sort of country left and having a good relationship with Ukraine. And at the same time, he wants to have a good relationship with Russia when it's over because the what this is really one of the sort of driving factors of President Trump, who's like 5 chess moves ahead of everybody else, is that he wants to make sure that the Russians and the Chinese don't have an enduring friendship that is aimed against the United States. So he wants to bring Russia into a better relationship, bilateral relationship with the U.S. We don't have one now. And so what he wants to do is have the war be over, but at the same time having Russia be a friend. So he could have the war be over and Russia being a friend by just forsaking Ukraine. He doesn't want to do that. He could protect Ukraine by putting these secondary crippling sanctions to try to destroy the Russian economy. But then what does he do? What does that do for Russia? It may bring them to the negotiating table on Ukraine, but what it does is shove them into the arms of the Chinese, which is the last thing we want. So Trump's trying to thread that needle. How do you have a deal? How do you make sure that Russia and Ukraine are your friends after the deal is done? How do you have a deal that has a chance of being sustained and kept for the next several years? And then I think he's looking ahead to what is the U.S.-Russian relationship going forward? And is Ukraine going forward after the war is done? Is Ukraine has an opportunity, if they seize it, to be a prosperous country? They have a lot of economic resources. They have agricultural resources, they have natural resources, they have a well-educated population. So after the fighting stops, again, Ukraine's losing the war, but after the fighting stops, Ukraine could win the peace.
And so as part of threading that needle, those sort of offhanded comments he made, or maybe not so offhanded, maybe that's unfair, the comments he made in the direction of security guarantees that, Europe will provide manpower because they're there, and, we'll provide the air support, sort of just generally talking about what the form of a security guarantee for Ukraine could look like with America's participation. Is that threading the needle such that our European allies know that Trump is committed to America being there as a backstop? He's not going to make Europe go it alone?
I don't think President Trump has answered a question about would that involve U.S. air defense. And he's been, I think, noncommittal. Some people have jumped on that and say, oh, right, the Americans are going to participate. We're not going to have boots on the ground, but we're going to provide air cover. I don't think President Trump's quite gotten there yet. I don't think he's committed himself to that. Okay. What he has committed himself to is that no U.S. military involvement, no U.S. military troops on the ground, no Marines are heading there. And he's also committed to this is not a NATO war with Russia. So I think that's part of the negotiating leverage. But what would President Trump do to help guarantee? Well, as President Trump said to my Fox News colleague Bret Baier when he was heading out to the summit with Putin, he said, look, I'm not going to tell you what my position is. I don't know. I've got to have the ability to bob and weave and improvise and pivot in order to get to where he wants. And, Dan, I mean, you and I have talked before about sort of the bigger picture stuff and what makes people tick. I think what makes Trump tick and why he's so successful at this stuff when nobody else has been is because he approaches it as a businessman. For him, time is money. He's a real estate developer. Until he builds that building, he doesn't have any money. He doesn't get the profit. Up until he builds the building, he's just got losses, right? He has to buy the land. He has labor, raw materials he has to buy. He also doesn't have a clear sense of how he builds the building. He might encounter real problems along the way, weather, supply chain problems, political problems, labor problems. So he wants to be able to improvise at each step. And that's why he's so different from any politician. A politician is worried about the next election, not building the building. He's worried about, okay, it can't look like I've made any mistakes here, so I've got my plan A, and if it doesn't work, I'm going to have more plan A, because otherwise I'll be held politically accountable. But for President Trump, he has a plan A, he has a plan B, he has a plan C, he has a plan D, and he's constantly improvising. So that's why I think in the end he gets there. I don't know how he gets there, what the steps will be. I doubt if he knows the steps along the way, but he'll improvise until he gets there.
How much in Trump's mind does the deal that he struck with Ukraine on minerals, on rare earths, how much does that vest the United States in Ukraine's future in President Trump's mind, do you think?
I mean, I can't, again, nobody speaks for President Trump but President Trump. But I think the Vice President, Secretary of State have all said, look, that's an implicit security guarantee.
Yeah, right.
This is an economic guarantee. If we are tying our economic future to Ukraine for something as important as rare earth minerals, which are essential to our national defense, they're essential to our economy. If we're doing that, that's an implicit guarantee. And it's also, I think, an implicit threat to the Russians. If they think, oh, well, we're going to move on Kyiv in 3 years' time when Trump is out of office, wait a minute. If you have American-Ukraine joint development of their rare earth minerals, so you have American engineers and miners and project managers, and you have thousands of Americans there, do you really think the Russians are going to push their tanks and kill all those Americans on their way to Kyiv? So I think it's a real deterrent to the Russians.
The last question before I let you go. You're a Cold War warrior, like a lot of those still populating conservative circles in D.C. But there does seem to be a debate that is going on really since the beginning of this war, since Putin invaded, which is, what is his realistic end game? I mean, don't tell me about his sort of philosophical godfather and his dreams of his revanchist dreams of reconstituting the old Soviet Union. Tell me what you really think he can get done, and how far that he can take this. I mean, is it really that if Ukraine falls, he's into the Baltics, he's into Poland, he's into Romania, and he just goes until somebody stops him, 20th century expansionist dictators of yore? I mean, or is it really he wants this eastern part of Ukraine, and he wants security on that perimeter for Russia, so no NATO involvement there, and that will settle him for the foreseeable future?
He wants what he can get. He'll then take whatever he can get. So that's why, if you look at the Cold War example of President Reagan, how did we defeat the Soviet Union? We bankrupted them.
Yeah.
They didn't have any money. So how do you defeat Vladimir Putin in the end? You bankrupt him. You make sure that he doesn't have oil revenues, coming from France, or natural gas revenues coming from Germany. He doesn't have the money to pay for that. And yes, I would look at it in another way. He wants to reconstitute the Soviet Empire. Yeah, he wants his mitts on the Ukraine territory. Yeah, he probably would like access and possession of some of the rare earth minerals or the resource-rich part of eastern Ukraine. But there's also got to be in his head. Remember, he believes in communism. He's a Russian patriot. And so if he thinks, wait a minute, if Ukraine could succeed in democracy and a strong economy like Poland has, like Germany has, like the Czech Republic, whoa, don't you think that would be a threat to Russia? That if our Russians who are not in a prosperous position, let's say after the fighting stops, do the Russians look and say, well, wait, if it can happen in Budapest, it can happen in Moscow. If it couldn't happen in Kyiv, it could happen in Moscow. So I think part of it is that he does not want them to succeed because it would be a threat to his own beliefs and obviously his own presidency.
KT McFarland, former First Deputy National Security Advisor to President Trump, author of Revolution, Trump, Washington, and We the People. KT, thank you as always. Appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And KT joined us on the Turnkey.pro answer line.
Before you see it on TV, share it on Facebook, or read about it in the paper. Hear it here first. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
People ask us all the time, when's the best time to replace an old air conditioner? Simple. Before it breaks. Because when it does, you know it'll be the hottest day of the year, and suddenly you're scrambling like hundreds of others to get help during a heat wave. At Air Right Heating and Cooling, we've seen it all. We know there's never a good time to be without AC, especially in Chicagoland, where the humidity can make 80 degrees feel like 100. At Air Right, our experienced technicians don't just work fast, they'll do it right. Browse through our more than 1,500 five-star Google reviews to see what our loyal customers love most about us. If it's been a while since your system was inspected, don't wait for a heat wave before having it checked out. And right now, AM 560